kind of starstruck when I met Gary because his father wrote the book, What Color is Your Parachute? How many of you ever read that book? I mean, if you're my age, it was probably the transformational book, you know, early in your career, and it's certainly, and I actually just bought the 2017 version of it, and it's just as up to date now as it ever was before. My role at Deloitte, and I've been with Deloitte 3 years through an acquisition, is to lead the research we do on the human capital issues that big companies have around the world. So for almost 20 years, I've been studying and researching and talking with big companies about what their issues and challenges really are. And if you look at, and over the last 2 or 3 years, as you can tell from this conference and all the wonderful technologies and platforms that you see here, organizations have struggled to figure out how to deal with the people issues behind what we call the new world of work or the future of work. And so what we did over the last month or so is pull together some research and some information and some insights based on many, many years of research that I've done and that we've done at Deloitte on what does this really mean about the world of work from an organizational perspective. So if you're a business leader, if you're an entrepreneur, if you're a senior executive, a business development person, what does this mean about your company and how can your company adapt? And then Gary's going to come up and we're going to talk about what it means for you as an individual, and then we're going to have a discussion about the social issues and what it all means. And it's not as simple as simply technology taking over jobs. It's far more complex than that. So in the next 30 minutes, I'm going to try to give you a good sense of what that means and give you some new ideas to help you think this through. Now, there's no question that everything's changing, and it's affecting all of us. And I see, you know, I read a lot, and I do a lot of, articles, and I read a lot of articles, and every day there's another article about jobs going away, robots. You know, China is now the largest market for robots. You probably saw that. It turns out in China, the robots are going to save China from actually the population decline that they're going to see in the future as a result of the one-child policy in China. We have this explosion of discussion about the gig economy and what that means. I took Uber over here this morning from Oakland, so I experience it every day, and we don't know whether that's good or bad, and what's the implication of that. And when you ask CEOs and business leaders, and we do this research, and we just did a project with MIT on this, they tell you they're not really sure what it means for them. In fact, 92% of the companies we studied and surveyed in the Global Human Capital Trends research from spring of this year said, we're not organized correctly to deal with the digital world we have to be in. But only 14% had any idea of what that new organization looks like. So I'm going to give you a little discussion about what that means. And of course, we don't know, and the fear, and I think one of the problems from all this press and all these books is we have this sort of strange feeling like this time the technology is different. I'll give you my perspective on that right now as I get into the material. I'm 60, so I entered the workforce in 1978. I went to work at IBM before there was a PC. We had an initiative at IBM called the Future Office, and it was about selling copiers. And believe me, and then when the PC came along, we called it the paperless office. How many of you have a paperless office? It never really happened. We sold more copiers after the paperless office than before the paperless office. So this is not a new conversation. We've had technology impacting work since the beginning. I have a funny story that one of my partners at Deloitte and I talk about. In the 1980s, when the Excel, or in fact it was VisiCalc, when VisiCalc was first invented, there was a big debate about the end of the Wall Street analyst. We don't need Wall Street analysts anymore because all the work they've done by hand will be done by a computer, and we won't need them. And guess what? That didn't happen. The opposite happened. They all became really good at using spreadsheets, and now there are more analysts and better analysts and more opportunities for analysis than ever before. So my experience is that artificial intelligence, and I like the IBM conversation yesterday about augmented intelligence, is not necessarily as simple as replacing jobs, and so don't believe everything you're reading. I think there's a little bit too much reactionary sort of press on this topic, and so that's what I'd like to give you some context about. So two things. What do your leaders think about this in your businesses, and what are they struggling with? And I would challenge you that unless you're the CEO of your company, I'll bet your CEO is confused about what this all means. And number two, what can you do about it? And I'm going to give you 5 things you can do about it based on our research. So let's get started. The first part of this presentation is talking about the context. So let me talk a little bit about the context. Number 1, huge amount of technology. Now listen, I'm an engineer. I studied engineering. I love technology as much as any of you. We have too much of it. We have too many messaging platforms, too many video platforms, too many communication platforms. In fact, as you'll see in a couple of minutes, our research shows that in the United States alone, every day, we check our phones 8 billion times. And this is Deloitte research. I'm not exactly sure how the research was done, but I believe that it's more or less right. And look at economic productivity. Every article that comes out on productivity, including the productivity numbers from 2 weeks ago, show that it's not going up. In fact, an economist from MIT recently wrote a book that said that this industrial revolution, the one based on mobile and social technology, is producing the least amount of productivity of any industrial revolution in the past. Less than indoor plumbing, less than the automobile, less than the electricity and the telegraph. So my challenge to you is more technology is not always better, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. Number 2, obviously AI and cognitive computing and whatever you call it is important, and it's huge. Just yesterday I read in Fast Company that Amazon now has 1,000 employees working on their voice recognition tool, the Amazon Echo. And by the way, I had a funny conversation with one of the Deloitte teams that works with the NSA in Washington, and they said they are really excited about the Amazon Echo. Can you imagine why? Because they can get all that information. In fact, they made a comment to me that somebody made a comment to me that the NSA can actually listen to your cell phone when you're in airplane mode. So there's a lot of data being captured, and there's a lot of cognitive computing being used. Another interesting fact, and this stuff is really incredible, another article came out 2 weeks ago that said some Stanford students did some research on voice recognition. Your phone can type 3 times faster and more accurately than you can. So that sort of Apple keyboard that's always been so hard to use, you don't really need it anymore. You can talk to the phone now and it'll do that. And all of these and my point on this chart is not to try to tell you yet what this means, but these are big, well-funded companies investing in this. Amazon, IBM, Google, Apple, Facebook, companies like Deloitte, they're putting big monies and big bets on this. And it's working, and there's lots of examples of this that you've seen in this conference. X-rays that are better read by technology, insurance claims that can be done based on photos without even telling the insurance company what kind of car you have. The photo can identify the car, the model, identify what kind of damage you had, and actually process a claim, almost all automatically. And one more example that I think is really important. The mobile phone that we carry around with us today, what's unique about it is not that it's mobile, it's that it's such a multifunctional platform. It has a temperature device, it has a GPS, it has a humidity device, it has an accelerometer. I believe there's 9 different sensors in that phone. So when you take artificial intelligence and sensors and mobility and the ubiquitous internet, you end up with things like this. The John Deere tractor, the new John Deere tractors, can plow a field completely accurately, can monitor the actual sense of the earth to plow it in the right locations, can plant the seeds in the right spot in the plows, can then water the seeds and check the humidity of the seeds when they're being watered, can go back and determine which seedlings are growing and which ones are not, and mulch the ones that need more fertilizer, obviously can then harvest the plants and can go back and rechurn all of that soil for the next generation of plants. That's all done through sensors, AI, visual recognition, stuff that's actually more or less off the shelf these days. So this is serious stuff. Does that mean we're not going to have farmers? Does that mean we're not going to have laborers? No, it means those people are obviously going to be doing different things, and this kind of technology is going to be involved. Number 3, I won't harbor on this because we all know it, but the amount of data we're collecting is just unbelievable. Listen, I'm a data guy. I used to work for Sybase. I've been in the database industry. I have never seen so much data. We have clients come to us and say, you know what, Deloitte, we have a lot of data. We don't even know what it means. Would you bring some actuaries in here and just make some sense of it and tell us what's important? I mean, companies really have almost too much data to know what to do with. And in the area of HR and talent and people, which I cover, we're doing some incredible predictive analysis of behaviors in the workplace that I'm going to tell you about. For example, almost 15% of companies now monitor or predict something about your behavior at work based on the data they're collecting about your activity at work. Your email traffic, Microsoft just purchased a company that monitors email metadata, so I wouldn't be surprised if fairly soon we see some features in Outlook 360 that tell you things about your communication pattern versus other companies, other people in your company. Companies are now looking at trust networks within organizations and determining who are the people that are most trusted based on communications, and therefore where do we have compliance risk or fraud risk in the company. And we actually talk to companies that have looked at the problem of theft, or what's called a toxic employee, somebody who steals something or commits harassment, and actually can identify where those people are and have found through data that those people are actually contagious. And that when you have people like that in the organization, other people within a certain number of feet of them actually behave the same way, which allows them to develop all sorts of interventions. So this is incredible stuff. I'm not making this up. To say nothing of the fact that we're going to be collecting data on our bodies, on our clothes. This is only the beginning. Fitbit is a company I've spent some time with. Fitbit told me the last time I talked to them that almost 50% of their Fitbits now are sold to HR departments on behalf of their employees. Because their employees are so overwhelmed at work, they're trying to find ways to give their employees tools to help them manage their lives better. So this is a really big deal. Number 4, are jobs going away? I don't believe they are. Every research study I've looked at, every analyst I've read, every book I've read essentially says that every time automation comes, we simply do different things. Again, going back to my personal experience, when I entered IBM, it was a funny days. If I think about it, we didn't even have voicemail. We got a little pink slip. You guys remember those little pink pieces of papers that your secretary wrote down what your messages were? If you wanted to write a letter to a customer, you wrote it longhand, you walked over to the steno pool. The steno pool had a bunch of people with typewriters, electric typewriters, and they typed it, and then they gave it back to you, and you edited it, and you went back and forth. In the early 1980s, IBM announced this thing called the display writer. It revolutionized the process of word processing. It was right before the PC came out. Those people didn't lose their jobs. They just got 10 times more stuff to do. So story after story after story of this. Let me give you another one that I think is a really interesting one. In the early 1980s, most of you remember, we started to see the automatic teller machine. And I'm sure at that point in time, articles were being written that this is the end of the branch banker. There will be no more branches. There will be no more tellers. It will all be doing our banking electronically. And there are now close to 1 million ATMs around the world. And guess what? The number of bank branch tellers is higher now than it was in the 1980s. We have probably 10 times as many branches, and the tellers are doing better things. They're selling, they're listening, they're coaching you, they're trying to help you solve problems that the ATM machine couldn't do. So I don't think the jobs are really going to go away. We've done a lot of research on this in Deloitte, and I just listened to a fascinating presentation, the last session on human performance. Things like courage, empathy, listening, understanding how people react. When you're in a meeting and somebody doesn't understand what's going on, that's a human skill to try to bring somebody up to speed and align a team. There are a whole library of skills in the occupational database that are not yet, and maybe will never be, automated by computers. And I won't go through them, but I think that is a fallacy and something we have to get a little bit beyond in the public press. Number 5, diversity. Now, I've done, I happen to live in Oakland, so I live in a very diverse, multicultural environment. I have 2 kids who are millennials. They're very comfortable in the world that we live. We've done study after study after study of diversity and inclusion using the research methodology we use in our business. Every single one shows that today, the highest performing teams, the best decisions, the best customer service comes from diverse and inclusive teams. There's a whole bunch of reasons for that. It turns out when you have a racially diverse team, people are willing to take more risks, believe it or not. When you have a gender diverse team, people feel safer and they're more willing to speak up. Certain things happen in a very positive way. And if you look economically and globally around the world is just getting more diverse. And it's unfortunate we're going through this funny cycle of being afraid of immigration, but the diversity is actually a very important part of economic growth. If you look at countries like Germany, Japan, the UK, and the United States, in fact, we are forecast to have a declining birth rate, whereas all of the really high growth countries are in Asia, in India, and in some of the more underdeveloped countries in the Far East and the Middle East. If our economies are going to grow, we're going to have to get comfortable with the fact that immigration is a positive thing and diversity of the country and the organization is a mandate. And that's why if you go down Silicon Valley and you meet with the heads of HR of almost every major corporation, they're going to talk to you about their program to reduce unconscious bias, build a better diverse workforce, stop recruiting people from top universities just because they're top universities, and on and on and on. So this is a big issue. By the way, part of the diversity issue is the fact that young people entering the workforce have changed the workplace. I won't take you through this because this has been written about many, many times. But when I go out and I talk to companies, mostly bigger companies, they're still struggling to figure out what is it that millennials really want. And you can see some of the things here. Most younger employees, and some of this is not because they're millennials, it's just because they're young, are looking for a more dynamic, inclusive, real-time workplace. And if you can provide them that will enable the new world of work that I'll talk about in a couple of minutes. So, and by the way, in most young people's minds, diversity isn't even an issue. Most of them grew up in a world that's highly interconnected and highly diverse, and it isn't nearly as big as an issue with people more our age. Number 6, we're going to talk about this with Gary. What is a career? It has completely changed. The traditional career, when I got out of college, I went to work for an oil company for a couple of years. You basically bolted yourself to a big brand company and you crossed your fingers that you would have a good career there, and you put your career in their hands and you hoped that they took good care of you, and you selected an employer based on your opportunity to grow in that company. That is so far from the truth of how the world works today. The BLS research that came out last year, and actually some of this was in Gary's father's book, says that the average employee today will look for a new job 17.2 times. Our kids will probably have careers that are 70 years in length, right? My kids will probably live into their 90s or their 100s, so they're probably going to be living, for many, many decades longer working than I am, and so they will have the opportunity to change careers, change companies, change professions, and so they're going to have to get comfortable with constant reinvention of themselves. And the issue that I find in most people that struggle with this whole topic is the fear and the really difficult process of continuously reinventing yourself. By the way, most of your employers understand that, and part of the solution to this, I talk about in a minute, is employers making it possible and also optimal for you to reinvent yourself at work. This I thought was a great example. This is an article from the New York Times that came out earlier this year. AT&T, which is a magnificent company, there's an article on this coming out in Harvard Business Review in about 2 weeks, basically issued an edict, and this is the CEO of AT&T in the New York Times, that basically said to his workforce, if you don't reinvent yourself, please leave. We don't want you here. If you don't learn about the new technologies that are driving the telecommunications industry today, we're not going to spoon feed you. We're not going to teach it to you. It's up to you. And that's a very, very different way of thinking about work and careers and the work environment that I'll talk about in a minute in this new world of work and this future of work. The final sort of context is this idea of the gig economy. And I would say there's a good and bad side to this. First, all of the research I've seen seems to show a very slow but steady increase in the percentage of the workforce that's operating in some contingent form. And I had an interesting conversation with Gary about this yesterday, and I think we'll talk about it in the panel. Many people that are going into contingent work are doing it as a survival. They don't have a job, they can't find a job, they're between jobs, they just moved, they have a new baby at home, whatever it may be, and so they're looking for something to do to supplement their income. But even separating that out, there does seem to be a trend towards a greater percentage of us working on contingent basis, and many, many companies like Airbnb and Uber and many others are now starting to make a lot of money selling platforms and building platforms to do this. The dark side of this, though, is something that Nick Hanauer, who's a fairly well-known VC, and other people are talking about, is the problem of income inequality. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I'm not really here to bring that up, but the people that are working in these jobs do not have vacation benefits. They do not have health care. They don't get sick days. They don't get paid time off when something bad happens at home. They're missing a lot of the basic fundamentals that we consider to be sort of expectations at work. And so I think we have some political work to do. There's a really interesting discussion by some Harvard professors about creating a new class of worker and a shared security account that allows people to invest in sort of a semi-security account when they're only working part-time so they get some benefits. So there's some issues there, and I do believe as an employer, if you're on the employer side, you have to take some responsibility for this, as I'll show you in a minute. Okay, so that's a little bit of the context. What does that all lead us with? Well, if I go back to business leaders again, and I look at all our research and all the conversations I have with CEOs and CHROs and other business executives, basically they're a little worried. They're worried about the engagement of their workforce. They're worried about their ability to constantly attract the right people. They're worried about transforming the skills of their workers faster and faster and faster, and whether they have the right people or the tools to do that. They don't know if they have the right leadership model to adapt to the types of changes that I just mentioned. And they are expecting to learn about these new digital economies with organizations like Singularity, or they're going to leave. A lot of the research we just did with MIT that just came out about a month ago shows that leaders that join organizations that don't feel that the organization itself is giving them the opportunity to learn new digital platforms and exponential technologies will quit and leave. And that bothers and that concerns and that worries CEOs also. And I can't tell you, I've been to retailers, I've been to pharmaceutical companies, I've been to manufacturing companies. This is industry-wide, healthcare everywhere. In addition to that, I think we have a problem in basically the work experience. Now, we wrote an article on this 2 years ago called The Overwhelmed Employee, and it was the second or third most frequently clicked on thing in the Deloitte website. It really struck a nerve. And basically what we did, and we've looked at this, and you're seeing this in many of the presentations I know that have been going on this week, most people at work are not keeping up. 57% of workers say they work more than 50 hours a day. The bottom right quote is the one that disturbs me the most. 40% of Americans believe it is not possible to succeed at work and have a balanced family life. Now, I'm not going to slam or get any of our technology companies in the Bay Area, but let's face it, most of the technology providers that are making a lot of money are selling addictive drugs. They would love you to get addicted to their tools. They would love you to have high levels of engagement. They would love to have gamification that's so exciting you can't put it down. And I can't tell you how many times I walked around this conference and almost bumped into somebody because they were so glued to their phone because of something that they had to do so importantly at that particular moment. Our job as employers, as organizations, as HR people, as business leaders, is to understand this and help people deal with it. And that is not simply adding more automation, that is learning how to use it, which gets me into the next part of my presentation. What do we do? What do we do about all this? Well, the bottom line I'm going to talk about 5 things, but the simple message is that it's all about people. It's not about technology. The one example that comes to my mind is Starbucks. Starbucks is an incredible company. They have pioneered so many things. You could probably walk into Starbucks, talk to your phone, it would listen to your voice, it would make your coffee, and it would be sitting there at the desk to take away. And it would take 1 minute, and it would be just as fast, or maybe 10 times faster than the experience you have today. But they don't do that. They have a line, you listen to and watch and smell the coffee. You have a relationship with the barista. The barista writes your name on the cup. By the way, I think that's a brand. That basically gets you committed to them because now it's your cup of coffee. It's your experience. It's your place to hang out. We have to think about our businesses in terms of the customer experience and what we're doing for the people. Starbucks pioneered healthcare benefits for retail workers, above minimum wage, all sorts of other things that at the time seemed a little bit odd, but they're a hugely successful company, and I think that's because they focus on people, not just technology. So let me talk about sort of 5 issues there. Number 1, we are not organized as hierarchies anymore. We've done the research on this. This is not holacracy, by the way. This is simply understanding that people work in teams. And even though your HR technology and your org chart looks like that picture on the left, people actually don't get work done based on that. They get work done based on the picture on the right. And when you actually agree and understand that and think about that, and think about the fact that these teams, some of which are being disbanded and growing at any time, are really the core of your organization, you will change the way you think about work. Jeff Bezos has a great quote. If I walk into a conference room and there's more than 2 pizzas for lunch, the team is too big. Academic research done by Thomas Allen at MIT found that you spend 2 orders of magnitude more time with people that are within 50 yards of your desk than anybody else. Why do you think all these companies are building giant campuses? So we can spend more time together in teams. And by the way, if you build an organization that's functioning like the right, and by the way, I guarantee you your organization's working that way whether you know it or not, you have to stitch the teams together so that they don't compete with each other, so they don't automatically or accidentally not share information. The story of how Sony lost the Walkman business to Apple was a story of a bunch of teams at Sony that were not talking to each other. We've done the research on this, and there's a lot of incredible things going on. Let me just give you a couple quick ones. Cisco is now rebuilding its entire talent strategy based on teams. They found that they have more than 30,000 active teams at Cisco, none of which are represented in the HR system or the ERP system anywhere. And so they're building a whole new talent enablement and leadership model based on how do we coach teams, how do we put people on the right teams, how do we assess people's value to teams, and maybe even changing the whole idea of compensation and compensating people based on their contributions to the team, not their individual goals. W.L. Gore, which has been a pioneer on this, a fascinating company, we had them speak at our research conference, has a rule that any business in W.L. Gore that has more than 100 people gets split in half, because they know that actually as organizations grow to more than about 75 or 100 people, the relationships break down. Manufacturing plants, retail stores, all over the world, you see groups of people that are around 100 or less. It turns out there's another piece of fascinating research done by another professor that found that our brains are wired to remember about 100 people. We actually don't know well more than about 100 people. And I can show you that research as well. Deloitte is a company that has no org chart. I won't spend a lot of time on Deloitte. You won't find one. It doesn't exist. It doesn't even matter because people are constantly being reassigned to new projects, working on new teams, and we have a whole reward system and compensation and a new performance management system based on that. And the final one I want to mention is a more traditional company, Young Brands. Young Brands owns Kentucky Fried Chicken and Taco Bell and a lot of your favorite brands. Young Brands has a business rule that every 1 to 2 years you change jobs. And you can go from retail to manufacturing to IT to HR, back and forth, and they have this incredible organization of people that are so well versed in different ways the organization works because they've adopted this focus on teams. Number 2, culture. The word culture is a loaded word. Everybody talks about it. Nobody quite knows how to define it, but I'll just give you a couple of thoughts here. In an organization that's being flooded with new technology, jobs are changing, people are worried about what team they're on and what team they're going to be on next. They don't really know what their career is. It's the culture that binds them together. We know this. This is just common sense. 88% of the companies in our last survey said that they believe their culture is a critical issue in their organization. Yet only 14% actually knew what a good culture would look like. Let me give you a couple of examples of the issue of culture. Employee engagement. This is brand new data of employee engagement from Glassdoor. I didn't make this up. It's not from a survey. It's real data of employees. You can see that there's basically a bell curve, and that there are a bunch of companies that are good at engaging their employees, and there are a bunch of companies that are not very good at it. And so I slice this data in a whole bunch of different ways. Who's on the right? Is it tech companies? Is it small companies? Is it new companies? Is it companies in California? What's new? What's unique about them? Absolutely no statistical correlation to any of those factors. The only thing that's unique about those companies is leadership and how they think about the people, and they think about the people first as part of their business and how their business goes to market. Two quick examples on that. This is a picture of one of the most highly engaged workforces in the world. This is a company in Detroit by the name of Quicken Loans. They are in one of the most boring, uninteresting businesses you can think of. Mortgages. It's a big business, but it's not very exciting. You don't get to build all sorts of AI stuff and build software all day. But they are a very, very highly engaged organization because they've taken their culture and they've written it down in a book, and it's a book this thick with examples and cartoons and all sorts of things that help people get excited about coming to work and feel flexible and adaptable as the work changes. Second example is this one, Aetna. 2 years, I think it was a year ago, this article came out in the New York Times. Aetna was facing the issue that the healthcare industry was about to become disrupted by Obamacare, and that they were going to suddenly be in the consumer business. The CEO of Aetna, Mark Bertolini, went into the call centers in Aetna, found that he had a 60% turnover rate. Most of the people in the call centers were making below minimum wage. None of them could even afford Aetna healthcare. They had no significant benefits, no work-life balance, nothing. He said, you know what, this isn't right. This is not the culture we want to bring to our customers. He changed the whole environment, raised the wages, gave them yoga classes, mindfulness, all the things that we kind of expect out here at Silicon Valley. A year later, the profitability, he believes that activity improved the profitability of Aetna by almost 2%. Number 3, you have to design an organization that facilitates learning. I won't spend a lot of time on this because I'm a little short on time, and we can talk about it at the break. But this means providing a culture and a set of learning activities and tools within your organization that allows people to continuously reinvent themselves. Your employees want learning in your company. It is now part of your employment brand. And if you don't provide that kind of learning and that kind of capability to them, they will go to work elsewhere. And there's lots of money and lots of tools and lots of ideas on how to do this, which I will not get into at the moment. The final one is one more, kind of running out of time. A couple more quick ones and I'll wrap up. The career. I talked about the career a minute earlier. I talked about AT&T. Let me give you one more example of careers in the future of work. Everybody know who Wegmans is? They're not really on the West Coast. Wegmans is probably one of the premier retail grocery chains in the United States. They're located mostly in the Northeast, but if you ever went into Wegmans store, I guarantee you went back. It's a beautiful place with incredible fresh food, all sorts of takeaway items. And I've met with Wegmans many times, and they said, you know what we do at Wegmans? We hire kids out of high school, and we tell them that if they come work for us, and they spend their summers with us, and they come with us when they get out of high school, we'll pay for them to go to college. And if they go to college and they continue to work for us and they take care of us, we'll give them a chance to run one of our departments, and we'll even give them a chance to open another store. And so they actually run their business around this talent model of allowing people to grow. And you won't find a more passionate workforce than Wegmans. And they win the best places to work almost every year as well. Final point is the one that I'll wrap up on, is this idea of design thinking. Design thinking is a great really revolution of how we think about work. And we have to start thinking about the entire work experience as an integrated experience, just like a customer experience. The employee experience is the customer experience. When you get on an airplane and the flight attendant is unhappy because of something at work, guess who gets the brunt of it? You do. When you call somebody on the phone for service on an IT department or whatever it is, and they're not having a good day because of work, you hear about it. This is a critical part of redesigning and dealing with this new world of work in the future, is creating this customer experience. And the final example I'll give you on that is GE, and I know we have some folks from GE here. We had the head of GE, culture at GE, Janice Semper, speak at our conference. GE is so focused on this issue of the employee experience that they have redesigned the way people are paid, redesigned what managers do, redesigned the way they do goals, completely focused a whole corporate level strategy on simplification to try to make the work experience at GE great for the employees and, of course, in turn, great for innovation and customers. And so this idea of thinking about the design of your workplace as a holistic thing is an important part of the future of work. So that's sort of an overview, and I'll bring up Gary in a minute. Jobs are not going away, but we have to think about our organization in a holistic way, and we also have a whole significant set of issues in public policy that we have to deal with. And I won't spend a lot of time on those. Maybe we'll talk about those at the break. But I want to thank you very much for your time, and it's been a pleasure for me to have the opportunity to come speak with you. Articles, and I read a lot of articles, and every day there's another article about jobs going away, robots. You know, China is now the largest market for robots. You probably saw that. It turns out in China, the robots are going to save China from actually the population decline that they're going to see in the future as a result of the one-child policy in China. We have this explosion of discussion about the gig economy and what that means. I took Uber over here this morning from Oakland, so I experience it every day, and we don't know whether that's good or bad and what's the implication of that. And when you ask CEOs and business leaders, and we do this research, and we just did a project with MIT on this, they tell you they're not really sure what it means for them. In fact, 92% of the companies we studied and surveyed in the Global Human Capital Trends research from spring of this year said, we're not organized correctly to deal with the digital world we have to be in. But only 14% had any idea of what that new organization looks like. So I'm going to give you a little discussion about what that means. And of course, we don't know. I was kind of starstruck when I met Gary because his father wrote the book, What Color is Your Parachute? How many of you ever read that book? I mean, if you're my age, it was probably the transformational book, you know, early in your career, and it's certainly, and I actually just bought the 2017 version of it, and it's just as up to date now as it ever was before. My role at Deloitte, and I've been with Deloitte 3 years through an acquisition, is to lead the research we do on the human capital issues that big companies have around the world. So for almost 20 years, I've been studying and researching and talking with big companies about what their issues and challenges really are. And if you look at, and over the last 2 or 3 years, and the fear, and I think one of the problems from all this press and all these books is we have this sort of strange feeling like this time the technology is different. I'll give you my perspective on that right now as I get into the material. I'm 60, so I entered the workforce in 1978. I went to work at IBM before there was a PC. We had an initiative at IBM called the Future Office, and it was about selling copiers. And believe me, and then when the PC came along, we called it the paperless office. How many of you have a paperless office? It never really happened. We sold more copiers after the paperless office than before the paperless office. So this is not a new conversation. We've had technology impacting work since the beginning. I have a funny story that one of my partners at Deloitte and I talk about. In the 1980s, when the Excel, or in fact it was VisiCalc, when VisiCalc was first invented, there was a big debate about the end of the Wall Street analyst. We don't need Wall Street analysts anymore because all the work they've done by hand will be done by a computer, and we won't need them. And guess what? That didn't happen. As you can tell from this conference and all the wonderful technologies and platforms that you see here, organizations have struggled to figure out how to deal with the people issues behind what we call the new world of work or the future of work. And so what we did over the last month or so is pull together some research and some information and some insights based on many, many years of research that I've done and that we've done at Deloitte on what does this really mean about the world of work from an organizational perspective. So if you're a business leader, if you're an entrepreneur, if you're a senior executive, a business development person, what does this mean about your company and how can your company adapt? And then Gary's going to come up and we're going to talk about what it means for you as an individual, and then we're going to have a discussion about the social issues and what it all means. And it's not as simple as simply technology taking over jobs. It's far more complex than that. So in the next 30 minutes, I'm going to try to give you a good sense of what that means and give you some new ideas to help you think this through. Now, there's no question that everything's changing, and it's affecting all of us. And I see, I read a lot, and I do a lot of, happen. The opposite happened. They all became really good at using spreadsheets, and now there are more analysts and better analysts and more opportunities for analysis than ever before. So my experience is that artificial intelligence, and I like the IBM conversation yesterday about augmented intelligence, is not necessarily as simple as replacing jobs, and so don't believe everything you're reading. I think there's a little bit too much reactionary sort of press on this topic, and so that's what I'd like to give you some context about. So two things. What do your leaders think about this in your businesses, and what are they struggling with? And I would challenge you that unless you're the CEO of your company, I'll bet your CEO is confused about what this all means. And number two, what can you do about it? And I'm going to give you 5 things you can do about it based on our research. So let's get started. The first part of this presentation is talking about the context. So let me talk a little bit about the context. Number 1, huge amount of technology. Now listen, I'm an engineer. I studied engineering. I love technology as much as any of you. We have too much of it. We have too many messaging platforms, too many video platforms.